It is now our pleasure to welcome two people who have been truly outspoken about the place of Black businesses and Black economic empowerment. John Rogers, the co-CEO of Ariel Investments, the oldest and first African-American owned asset management firm, and Robert Smith, the founder, CEO, and chairman of Vista Equity Partners. Robert, John, thank you so very, very much to you both for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
John, I think we're going to start off this conversation with you. I mean, you've spoken eloquently and with extraordinary passion and detail about not only the economic health of Black America, a topic that Dr. Rouse had introduced the conference with earlier, but also the state of Black businesses. What are you seeing today? And what has been its trajectory, as you can view it, over the last couple of years?
Well, when it comes to Black business, I'm fortunate to be from Chicago, where we were seen as the Mecca of African-American businesses. And when I got home from college, we had these extraordinary businesses that were doing so well 40 years ago. You had the largest Black bank in the country, Independence Bank. You had Johnson Publishing, which was an extraordinary business with, Ebony and Jet and all the historic things they did. You had Johnson Products that had Afro Sheen and Ultra Sheen and over 500 employees in this beautiful factory on the South Side. It was extraordinary. Today, all those businesses are gone. We've lost it all. And when you look at the Crain's list in Chicago, they list the top 150 privately held businesses in Chicagoland every year. 20 years ago, roughly, we had 3 of the top 150 companies. Not great, but 2%. Now we have 0 of the top 150 companies are African-American. 0 out of 150 privately held companies. So we have gone backwards substantially. There are really no African-American businesses of scale in Chicago. And most of us are just rounding errors relative to our majority peer groups. I would say Robert Smith is the one exception of a business that's out there that's gotten to scale nationally, but very, very few companies have. And the last data point I would just say is, when it comes to college-educated Blacks, we have been going backwards dramatically. Ray Bashar and the St. Louis Fed has this great data that shows between 1992 and 2016, college-educated African-Americans saw our wealth decline 10%, while college-educated whites saw their wealth increase 96%. So it just shows you, when it comes to economic growth and business growth, we are going backwards very rapidly.
That is such a critical intervention. It's an important intervention, particularly when you think about the arc of history. And you think about what it means to have a Black institution, to have to have Black businesses, not just Black CEOs in other institutions, but to have institutions from and by their communities. Robert, when you listen to this particular overview and this trajectory, which is certainly one that requires a lot of attention. Where do you see the specific place of Black banks? I mean, we've heard a little bit about the decay of, again, Black businesses, but where do Black banks fit in this particular story?
Thanks, Chris. The critical part of being in business in America that is missing in our community is access to capital. John and I fight literally every day to access capital. And we have businesses of size and scale and capacity. Nearly 70% of Black neighborhoods do not have a branch bank. In Denver, Colorado, and in my neighborhood, which was an all-Black neighborhood, middle class, striving individuals, many of the businesses were owned by the people in the community. There was not a bank or a branch bank in our community. And what we have now seen, of course, is nearly half the Black-owned banks have closed in the last decade. And the collective capitalization of those remaining is 25% lower than it was in 2008, 2009. And credit is an important part of building capacity, economic capacity in our communities. It's important to spur entrepreneurship, to create, a people to give thought to taking risk and growing businesses and hiring ultimately people within their communities. And the prior session talked about the, CDFIs and MDIs are critical in that regard. Well, when we, encountered the dynamic that the pandemic, brought forward, that Black banks and Black communities were not getting access to, PPP loans. And we had the good fortune of getting the ear of many of our senators, including at the time Senator Kamala Harris and Senator Warner, Senator Schumer, et cetera. And we also had access to Treasurer Mnuchin at the time. We were able to get capital carved out for our CDFIs and MDIs, but it also laid bare the fact that our CDFIs and MDIs are frankly underinvested from their technology. Modern Bank is essentially a technology company, and investments in tech infrastructure are critical in order for our banking infrastructure to be able to deliver capital to the small and medium businesses in our communities. And that's something that has to be addressed now. There are some barriers to that we have to work through, but there are very large tech companies that are focused on how do we actually do that. And we've got some initiatives through our 6 cities, Southern Cities initiatives to modernize about 24 of these CDFIs and MDIs to make a more efficient delivery of capital into our community. And that is essential. It is critical. And that is a lifeblood to any entrepreneur, is access to capital.
Yeah, I'm going to return to that topic in just a second in terms of, the technology and technology rails for banks. But just sticking with the general question about the fact that we now, post-pandemic, we're all living in a digital economy right now. Digitization, the electronification of the economy is now a reality. It's not something that you can ignore. John, when you hear Robert's points about technology, do they strike a chord with you about not just banks, but really the general positioning of Black businesses overall? Again, especially after a year in which most of us have found ourselves at home.
Well, it's interesting, as you know, in this last year of COVID, the businesses that African Americans are in primarily, construction, retail, catering, we've been devastated by COVID. Folks that are in the technology world, the digital world, money management world, finance world, we've been able to do well in this horrific year for our country and the tragedy of George Floyd. We've been able to, hold our own. So it brings up this point that I think is so important. Our economy has evolved over the last 40 years or more from a kind of a manufacturing-based economy to now a professional services, financial service, technology, and media-based economy. And we haven't moved with it when it comes to our community and economic opportunities for us. And part of the problem is this term supplier diversity. Whenever a progressive institution, anchor institution, university, hospital, corporation wants to do business with Black people, they think about supplier diversity. And they think about construction and catering and janitorial services, which are very important businesses. But those have the lowest margins, the least amount of growth, and the least wealth being created there. We need to move that term supplier diversity into a modern terminology of business diversity. That's what the University of Chicago uses, where now the University of Chicago works with 90 professional services and technology firms with their spend here in Chicago. And why can't all institutions make that leap? Because otherwise, I say it's a modern day Jim Crow if the Black and brown people can only do the catering and the construction, and the white men get to do the technology, be a part of this digital world, have the venture capital firms, have the private equity firms, have the hedge funds, and heads up of all the other kind of professional and financial services that are out there. So we have to transition. We want to bring wealth to our community. We have to be able to participate in the parts of the economy where the wealth's being created today. And I can't overemphasize how important that is. Supplier diversity is like Blockbuster Video versus Netflix.
Essential wisdom and understanding that the overall ecosystem has to be one. And I began this conference by saying that Black people have the same right to high quality, cutting edge financial services as anyone else, and to expect the best from our policy community and also to expect the best and to support local communities. Robert, when you hear this, what kinds of steps do you think are needed to upgrade the technology rails of banks? I mean, technology is a big term, and you can think of a million different areas of technology, from alternative data and credit scoring to open banking to blockchain technology. I mean, you name it. Regulatory compliance, AML, KYC. I mean, there's a lot to technology, and there's a lot of innovation really at almost every point in the supply chain of the provision of financial services. What kinds of where do you start? When you think about upgrading Black banks.
Yeah, I think it is quite simply the most important thing that one can do is build out what I call their core banking and lending management capacity. We've actually scoped out with Microsoft, a cloud-based set of solutions that said, okay, if we were going to take all the MDIs and CDFIs that are in our communities, what's the scope? It's about $500 million, $524 million to be precise. And if you think about the $12 billion that's been carved out, part of my mind should be, let's carve out the 500 million of that to actually modernize these banks. When you modernize these banks, you actually have lending velocity and capacity to now start to create more efficient lending. Again, these are small loans in many cases to the small and medium businesses in the communities. When you have a community that doesn't have a branch bank, doesn't have a relationship, modernizing that banking infrastructure actually gives you reach and gives you access to those small to medium businesses. And then they have access where they actually now create a relationship. And it's a digital relationship, one that you can actually evaluate, how that business has been performing. And just to finalize that, you then have to modernize the underlying infrastructure of these small to medium businesses. When you actually implement a enterprise software solution in a small business, it's about a 900% return on investment. There aren't very many investments on the planet that have that sort of return. So I think we have to take a holistic view and understanding that the world has moved to this fourth industrial revolution. Everything is being digitized, and we need to enable our small to medium sized businesses, African American, Latinx businesses, to compete globally. But in order to do that, we have to enable them. We have to make sure they have broadband access, and we have to ensure that their banking access is actually one that is efficient with and decrease the friction, and that's through a modernization effort.
Right. I guess then, as we turn to that modernization effort, we heard earlier, and today it was announced, an expansion of the CDFI fund. But a lot of the support, particularly for Black banks, will also come from the private sector. Are Black banks a good investment? And John, I'll start it off with you. I mean, you are you're both one of the two of the premier investors in the country. Are Black banks a good investment? And if so, or if not, why?
Well, I think Black banks can be a very, very good investment. And I think as we as a community start to think about ways that we can invest with each other, invest with each other's banks, with each other's mutual funds, all the different asset classes that are out there, we can be supportive of each other. But I would say one of the things about Black banks, and I've been having this conversation for the last 38 years since I started Ariel, there's no reason why Black banks can't expand into the parts of the financial sector where really wealth's created today. If you think about it, the big white banks have investment banking operations. They have often wealth management platforms. They've diversified broadly, so they're not just dependent on lending money. They have these other parts of their arsenal that help them build wealth for their companies. So that's what we need to do as Black banks. We want to be successful at Black banks. We should be diversifying into wealth management, into investment banking, maybe into money management, all the different aspects of the ecosystem where the big banks are. We should be able to be there too, because we have the talent to be great, but we shouldn't be so narrowly focused.
Yeah, I think that's really useful. And, Robert, when you hear that, are Black banks good investments, and you hear about these other allied areas, and in a technology economy, you can think of a number of allied areas. I was thinking the other day about big data and how minority communities have a certain kind of data that others don't have. Like what does that necessarily mean? But again, from your standpoint, are Black banks good investments?
And to John hit it right on the head. They can be. There's a couple of elements. Like every ecosystem has a strata. When I think about the CDFIs and MDIs, one thing they need more is either grant or tier one capital. Every dollar that an MDI gets as tier one capital gives them $8 to lend. Versus, let me put a deposit into that bank, and that of course creates a liability for the bank. They can only lend basically off of the profits. So to some extent, we have to ensure that we inject capital in the right places. Tier one, we have to inject capital into modernization, because these banks actually have access to these entrepreneurs and a vast swath of them. So when you think about that gives you the ability to say, now you see a business that's growing, $10 million, $30 million in growing 40% because they've been modernized. Well, that's when you start to bring in other investment services, investment banking services, which actually enable those small to medium businesses to grow. I have a friend who manages about 14,000, African-American entrepreneurs in an ecosystem. Less than a third of those are actually banked by traditional banking sources. They are looking for venture capital and other sources. So, the market is there, the opportunity is there, but you have to get the modernization, and you have to put capital in the right forms at the right levels, which frankly for those banks is really tier one capital and equivalent for the CDFIs, where they can actually lend it effectively. Last point, the CDFIs and MDIs have shown me in the minority communities, they actually have a lower default rate than the FDI insured overall group of banks. So actually on a risk return basis, it actually makes a lot of sense. Their values often are a little smaller in terms of the lending, but you have to build an infrastructure in order for that to be managed effectively.
Yeah, and that's it. How do you develop that kind of infrastructure to service the particular needs of minority communities? And can you leverage that into some kind of competitive advantage is, I think, going to be one of the key issues that not only the private sector is going to have to think about, but also the public sector. And, just closing that thought out, when you have regulatory requirements saying you can't discriminate, well, is there something that these institutions know that even white institutions can learn from?
Well, I'll tell you, the language in the $12 billion carve-out is still unclear as to whether that capital can be deployed for modernization or versus capital for lending. And I think it would be ideal for the administration to actually be very clear about that. And if they were, this would really open the door to really getting capital into our communities.
Yeah, gentlemen, thank you so very, very, very much. Economic empowerment is obviously very much in line with why we celebrate emancipation, and empowerment is about independence, and it's obviously about our communities. Thank you so much to you both for taking the time out to speak with us. It's been a unique dialogue. Perhaps far too uncommon a dialogue, and very much a valuable one. Again, to you both, thanks so much for dropping in and sharing your insight for this conversation. We'll now turn to our
Thank you,
Brown. Thank you.